Thank you, Kim, for that great introduction. I will echo words that Caitlin Carey said yesterday. It's tremendously humbling to be up here in front of you, in front of this very august group of scientists. And it's great that you do this as a career for a long time, and I still get incredibly nervous, so bear with me. And part of this is I wasn't quite sure what to say or how to start it. Thinking a lot about getting this award and trying to figure out how exactly it is that I went from a pretty mediocre college student to being here to talk to you guys today, so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. It starts here. When I was an undergraduate, I applied, when just about to graduate, I applied for a position as a plant ecologist at the newly forming Institute of Ecosystem Studies. And those of you who know me well have heard this story before. I was completely unqualified for it. And Dave Strayer called me up and asked me if I wanted to interview for a job in limnology. I thought that sounded so cool. I arranged the interview, hung up, looked up the word limnology, and got the job. So there we go. But I really could not have wished for a better first mentor to introduce me to the field. Dave was great. We would have these walks between the lab at the Carey Institute down to the study site in Wappingers Creek, and I would grill him, and Dave would tell me stories and things like that about limnology, about science. I asked him about his dissertation, which was about the micrometabenthos of Mirror Lake. I asked him why he studied those, and he said in a straight face, because I too can pass through a 64-micron mesh. He told me about the life history of uniotid mussels, and by this time I've gotten his sense of humor down. I think he's full of it. It took me a few days before I bought that one. He also told me about his scientific heroes. There were many, but three that I remembered particularly well off the bat were Gene Likens, Stuart Fisher, and Bob Wetzel. At that time, Gene Likens was starting the Institute of Ecosystem Studies up from scratch. He was Dave's advisor, and he was there, and really, Dave was such a great advocate for the work that Gene did in Hubbard Brook and how he really set the field of ecosystem forward in a really important way. Stuart Fisher was Gene's first student, and he I met him that summer at the IES, and he became my PhD advisor, and I'm going to talk a bit more about Stuart. And also Bob Wetzel for his fastidiousness and attention to detail as a limnologist, and I had an opportunity as a postdoc to work with Bob at the University of Alabama. Another person that Dave talked quite a bit about as a hero of his was G.E. Hutchinson. And at the time, it just really didn't sink into me about why Dave was so really in awe of Hutchinson. He had important influence on Dave's work, studying the energetics of these small organisms in Mirror Lake. But I think the seed had been planted within me to really begin to think of Hutchinson also as a hero. But it wasn't one day until one day when Dave made an offhanded remark about Hutchinson, who at that point was alive but an old man, and Dave said, "I wonder what his driver's license looks like." I'm like, what? And then it dawned on me, this is back to me being the mediocre student, that in between classes and going to labs, I used to go and hide here. This is the Klein Science Library at Yale, and go hide in the back stacks and study. And it dawned on me a couple of weeks after Dave made that remark that strange old gentleman in a blue blazer and a tie that I saw all the time, reading German textbooks, sometimes napping next to textbooks and journals, was Hutchinson. And I keep thinking, he was there all the time. He was writing the fourth of his treatises. And I keep thinking now, what would I have asked him if I had been clued in at all about limnology? And I don't have an answer to that question yet. Maybe I'll ask somebody in their prelims. But really, Hutchinson is one of my scientific heroes. What he has done as a scientist has really shaped the field of ecology and the field of limnology. It's tremendous, the ideas that he has generated from niches and species diversity issues. His role as a mentor is remarkable. The breadth of the science that he covered is unparalleled, and he did it while taking mathematical or theoretical approaches paired with empiricism. And it's sort of that mixture of approaches that really I think I would like to talk a little bit more at this point going forward. And this is something that Amina has actually set me up well for, or is very complimentary to the remarks that she's made, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we do science, how I do science, and what are some of the best ways to do this. As Kim said in her introduction, I've worked in a whole bunch of different systems, and from mayfly life histories in Texas to now working on the lakes in Wisconsin. And I don't know if it's a cause or an outcome, but I have a wicked shiny object problem. And I suspect I'm not necessarily alone in this room in this respect, but so that's me, and this is part of the reason that I've spent time thinking about how we do science. And this is okay, but sometimes it does get you into trouble and into some very unproductive avenues. So I think I've been fortunate to not go down too many of the recycling bin holes. I think the reason why are lessons that all scientists learn along the way, but there have been really sort of basic, straightforward things that have resonated with me, that have prevented me from being there. All right, and it really started with Stuart Fisher. He just had a profound influence on me as a mentor and shaped who I am as a scientist and taught me some really basic lessons on doing science. Stuart, of course, we were at Arizona State. He worked on Sycamore Creek, where I got my PhD. I arrived there. Stuart had done a great deal of work, along with Nancy Grimm and various graduate students there, on the effects of floods on these desert streams. And I got very interested in a different, more complicated and messy disturbance of water loss. And I arrived there and I figured this out. I got very excited. I wanted to do all these experiments. I had some questions. Great. And so I was like, yeah, sure. He reminded me that, in fact, the scientific method is a little bit more involved than that there's some other steps that I was glossing over, and really that the important part is we don't know much at this point about intermittent streams. They had been badly ignored by stream ecologists. We just really didn't know much about them, and yet here I was jumping ahead to want to do these cool experiments. Stuart just gently reminded me, well, not that gently, that the first step in the scientific method is making observations. And really, you've got to, if you don't know what the system is like or you don't know anything about the particular process, you've got to make these observations, and good observations beget good questions. Very simple and straightforward thing, but I'm an avid supporter of descriptive research as a good way to start a project. The second important lesson I got from Stuart was this balancing of breadth and depth, which I think is a very good complement to some of the remarks that Amina has made. Again, Stuart worked in Sycamore Creek. This was as Gene Lycan's first student here, this was his Hubbard Brook. It's a system that he had gotten to develop an intimate understanding of and the major drivers, and really was able to do a lot of things because of that understanding. When I arrived, Maury Vallette was a graduate student there, and then Andrew Bolton arrived shortly thereafter as a postdoc. Maury was interested in working on the hyperrheic zone. This is a vast, saturated area below the stream surface. Sycamore Creek was a great model system for that, with expansive sand areas that are saturated, so it had a very large influence on the metabolism, and Maury was going after just exactly how that worked. Andrew liked organisms, kind of an outlier in our group, and decided to study the invertebrates that lived in the hyperrheic zone, and I think Stuart's words were, yeah, good luck with that, because we were pretty sure that, there was just bacteria down there. That was it. So Andrew goes out and samples, and lo and behold, finds these totally weird invertebrates that are usually found in deep groundwaters and caves. This is a bathymelation. How many of you guys have heard of them? Bob Hall wins the prize. Yeah, they're pretty strange organisms, but there they were. And you know, I think Stuart admitted that he was very surprised and shocked about this and figured, look, we just don't call up science yet. That we need to provide context for understanding these things. And really, you know, this is high value to know a lot about your system, but it is just one system. And so this resulted in sort of emphasizing that broader breadth form, or as I think of it as sort of this T-type approach to doing science. And this resulted in Maury and Andrew spearheading just sort of an epic road trip around Arizona and sampling a group of streams to see what the hyporheic sediments, what they were like, if they were holding these invertebrates there, and what other chemical attributes of the hyporheic zone was, and where Sycamore Creek fit in on this spectrum. Well, it sort of turned out in some ways Sycamore Creek was a little bit of an outlier in terms of its low diversity. These organisms were everywhere, and all these streams, and they had a very high diversity relative to most groundwater systems, and providing that context sort of provided the assurance that they're on the right path, and really that the context is there for understanding the deeper mechanisms and processes that Sycamore Creek had revealed in subsequent studies. Now again, I don't think this is anything new and different, but sometimes I think as we rush ahead, we sort of forget that it is, you know, we need to do all these things, and I think that that combination of both breadth and depth, and again, referring to the work, the comments that Amina made, is just really a potent combination in understanding how lakes and streams work, or in fact, how the world works. Sort of related to this, I've continued to be interested in sort of approaches to science and how best to manage my shiny object problem. Steve Carpenter, my colleague, has thought a great deal about this as well, and he has a metaphor that I really like a lot about ecology being a table held up by 4 legs, and each of these being approaches to how we do our science, of this combination of experiments, long-term analyses, comparative studies, and then theory or concept development. This seems very straightforward. It didn't necessarily strike me as particularly controversial, and just really is, I think, a good thing to keep in mind, these different ways of addressing questions. And yet the reality is, there are debates about how best to do research. Which approach? Do we have breadth? Do we have depth? Do we use experiments or not? Sometimes these debates have been acrimonious. And I'm particularly aware of one set of these sort of lively discussions that has unfolded under the past few years that I think is particularly relevant in this world we're living in right now of accelerated changes. So this is just a cartoon timeline of Lake Mendota and some of the changes that the lake has experienced since Europeans arrived around 1800. And there's just this increased number of changes that are underway and types of changes, and it just seems like the world is moving faster and faster. Now, at the same time, along with all these changes, we're also in this era of a rapid expansion of knowledge. There's this rapid growth in the number of data sets. Okay, so this is a graph here showing the number of lakes sampled per year as illustrated in the Lagos data set. This is a data set that has been put together by a group of us led by Pat Serrano from state and federal data sources and researcher sources. And yes, we use Amina's data. It's awesome. There we go. So you can see increasing rates of data sampling over time. Okay. There is this growth, this rapid expansion in computational and statistical capacities that wasn't present even 10 years ago. The number, now it's par for the course that our graduate students are awesome at R, even if we are not. And as a result of these two ingredients, the inevitable third part of this is there's been this tremendous expansion in publications. And again, you can just see here, looking at the rate of increase in publications for lakes and rivers. And I know lakes are awesome, but what the heck, guys, we need to pick it up here. Streams are... Right. So I think, we'll talk later. I think as a result of all of these changes, we've gone from not a lot of knowledge to now having all this data and some number of new technical tools and things like that. Some people describe this as this transition from individual researchers going out and collecting samples or and taking them back to the lab to this thing that Jim Collins, who at that time was I'm going to get this wrong, the deputy AD, something like that, and an important person at NSF, gave a plenary talk at the Long-Term Ecological Research Program about what he envisioned to be the ecologists of the future. He put this figure up on there, and there was just this groan in the room. I was like, no, this can't be ecology. And he said, yes, this is going to be ecology. You're not going to have your graduate students may not be going outside very much. And this is, this is true. This is a lot of where we are with a lot of our science, that we take advantage of automated sensors and things like that. And that's challenging for a discipline based on studying lakes and ecosystems that are actually outside. And I've been particularly aware of the tension that builds associated with these growing pains from both sides. Right? I'm the head of the North Temperate Lakes Long-Term Ecological Research Program at the moment. We do many things, and one of those is we produce a lot of data. And to quote Amina, please use it. Okay, so we do a lot of data production. It's online and available. On the other hand, I'm part of this Lagos group that is spearheaded by Pat Serrano and Kendra Cheravillo, and that is a project where we are gathering data, not generating it, compiling it, integrating it so we can use it to ask other questions. So I've seen this sort of coming and going of data, and they're very different perspectives, so I can sort of see both sides of the argument. There has been some pushback, obviously, against this idea of using other people's data, doing science with data sets that you have not collected and don't know. These are just a couple of examples from conservation biology that have been in the literature very recently about these sort of growing pains problems of this sort of science. And so I have come to think of it in my mind as this story of love and angst. And I'm putting big data in quotes here because I'm reminded very often by Corinna Gries, who I work with, who's a fantastic data scientist, that as limnologists, really our data sets are not all that big, but they certainly are challenging and rich in their diversity and heterogeneity. We're working on the big part, but it's certainly more than we had before. So, on the angst side of the equation, when we're asked to provide our data for publication or to meet the requirements of the LTER program or whatever it may be, it takes time to make it orderly and explained or something like that. As I say to my graduate students, this won't happen, by the way, you guys, what happens if you get hit by a bus? We need to have your data. It takes time to keep it orderly, so look both ways when you cross the street. So this is part of the angst. You spend a lot of time and effort producing your data, sometimes you just don't want to give it away. There's concerns that you'll get scooped if you do it. That may not be true because a lot of the requirements are to provide it upon publishing it, so that's something that takes the edge off of that. And I think there's also a very large concern about data misinterpretation or misrepresentation of someone doing something really stupid with the data that I spent so much time generating. Well, that's not my problem, I guess, and it's there, so we have the resource there to have the discussion. And I think the third problem or criticism that has arisen is this idea that science, this sort of data-driven approach to science, is you're not asking questions, right? You're on a fishing expedition, I got it. And you're not really asking good questions. You're just sort of hoping you'll find something there. And I should say, right. So on the love side of the equation, I would say that this sort of approach is a new angle or a new version of doing science, right? So again, I think of Stuart's words. If you are on a fishing expedition, observation is the first step in the scientific process. We now have these data sets that cover the entire continental United States. In the case of programs like GLEON that are worldwide, where we can see things as limnologists we just have never been able to see before. It has opened up doors for asking questions as well through meta-analyses and syntheses, and it's been it's emerging as a very powerful tool across all environmental sciences. We know now that sharing your data will lead to increase in citation rates. That's good. We want people to read our papers. I would argue another major strength of this approach, too, is having the transparency and repeatability in this era where science is, this alternative facts things. It's good to have it all there on the table and not hide anything. And then finally, Pat Serrano and Kendra, again, and their colleagues have written a really elegant paper about this as a means of leveling the playing field, of everyone having access to information and being able to use it and not favoring well-funded programs or nations or things like that. And really refers to providing your data as an inclusionary and democratic approach to science. So I think in terms of this tension that has emerged of sort of dealing with traditional approaches to what we think of as traditional approaches to doing limnology versus this sort of data-driven one, it's a bit of a false dichotomy, and certainly in terms of making your data available and so forth, I think the benefit is becoming increasingly clear. Of course, that the benefits far outweigh the costs. This is what is driving now the process of a lot of journals, not just L&O letters that I'm familiar with, but also the AGU journals, many countries, to now be having policies of open data and sharing what you have learned about the environment. But it is the thing that really strikes me as interesting in the context of this talk and thinking about Hutchinson is these sorts of debates are nothing new. And I think sometimes having debates about how we do science and what we understand it's a healthy part of the process. I'm really familiar with one of these. We have this as part of our limnology class, what I teach to a lot of students at University of Wisconsin. About a debate that happened between Hutchinson and these other handsome gentlemen who are E.A. Burge and Chauncey Judet. And they had very different approaches to how they did limnology. On one hand, Judet and Burge were inveterate empiricists. They believed in understanding lakes in terms of this gradual accumulation of data gathered from many, many different lakes. Whereas Hutchinson was, in fact, very much a theorist. He thought of individual lakes as models in which you could derive principles and test them in other systems. And it's great because this was at times an acrimonious disagreement about approaches. I'm sure some of you know about these things, but there's some great quotes that they generated. So apparently Judet wrote a letter to his friend Devi at one point, I think in the forthcoming book, where he goes, yes, I love this. I shall expect them to tell us all about a lake thermally and chemically by sticking one or perhaps two fingers, didn't say which fingers, into the lake, and then going into a mathematical trance and telling us all about its biological variables. Well, so Hutchinson's students, not Hutchinson, because I think he was a gentleman, came back with a rejoinder of saying, Judet was capable of making 10,000 measurements without a single idea. So, and we as a discipline seem to have survived this controversy, and this is, to me, it sort of sounds a lot like the recent one that we have had about this sort of big data, open data discussion, and I think it's great because, we have gone forward, we can do both approaches, and we can be productive. So, to sort of begin, I think I may need these in a minute. To wrap up, I think, what is the best way to do science? I think it's really obvious, and we all know there is no one best way to do it. And from my work that I've done doing some synthesis work with my colleagues, my graduate students and postdocs, it's become really clear in doing these sort of meta-analyses that really in the vast majority of cases that big advances in our understandings are not these suddenly, oh my gosh, moments. They are the results of steady accretion of information from multiple systems, from taking multiple approaches, done by multiple investigators. So it's definitely this preponderance of evidence. And I think there's a corollary to that, which is, as an individual scientist, a little bit of that shiny object thing is not that bad. As an individual, having some of these incorporated within is a good thing. I know I have personally benefited mightily from working in all these different systems, working with different people, and using different approaches. And just to really get to the end here, I'm borrowing some insight from my colleague Steve Carpenter, who has just recently made a transition from being a professor to a free-range scientist, and has been thinking a great deal about these same sorts of things about doing science and what he has accomplished. And he passed something along to me about some quotes from Albert Einstein, who said that combinatory play seems to be the essential feature of productive thought. So collaboration is a way to go. And then Steve's text went on to say, Einstein believed that all he accomplished, indeed all that anyone accomplishes, is through the relationships with other human beings. The individual is what he is and has a significance that he has done not so much in the virtue of his individuality, but rather as a member of the great human society which directs his material and spiritual existence from cradle to grave. So, this is my cue and my opportunity to say thank you to all these people that I've worked with, and I apologize, I ran out of space. There are other people I've left off this. I've been honored to work with these awesome people. So, that's it.